I'm pro Biden. I don't have a problem with what is going on right now. I find it to be absurd that people don't appreciate how absolutely existential a threat Donald Trump is. I think it's a binary decision. That's my opinion. It's my show. That's my opinion. But Basil, I'm going to start with you. The New York Times editorial board is calling on President Biden to leave the race after his debate performance on Thursday. Mr. Biden is not the man he was 4 years ago, according to the Times. The greatest public service he could do and perform is to announce that he will not continue to run for re-election. But it goes on to say, if the race did come down to Trump versus Biden, they would pick Joe Biden. So, Basil, should Joe Biden drop out of this race?
No, first of all, I strongly disagree with the opinion, but I also wonder whether it was really appropriate for them to do that. But having said that, you know, if Joe Biden just stood on that debate stage and said nothing and let Donald Trump speak for 90 minutes based on Biden's record and Donald Trump's statements, I think Joe Biden would have still won that debate. But I understand it's a visual medium. It's, you know, there's so much riding on the outcome of this election. The stakes are so high. People's feelings and emotions are so strong around what happens in this race. I get why there's some consternation and some disappointment, perhaps. But as you said, you know, if you really look at the choices that are being framed for the voter, you have a person in Joe Biden who has an outstanding record, not just as president, but also, frankly, through Kamala Harris and Hakeem Jeffries and so many others, uniting the party around a common vision, versus Donald Trump, who has suggested openly that migrants should fight each other for residency in this country. So when you put those two things together, I do think that the calls to have some kind of confrontation where we make a change midstream is premature.
You know, Tara, I want to stick with the idea that this really wasn't a debate. A debate is an opportunity for viewers that are watching to learn something about the candidates. And yes, maybe we do have a familiarity with Donald Trump and Joe Biden because we've seen them before. And yet, I don't think the onus should have been on Joe Biden to have to fact check Donald Trump in real time. I did have an issue with the structure of how this debate went. But, you know, there was this new Morning Consult poll that was taken after Thursday's debate, Tara, and it finds that it's an unchanged presidential race with President Biden getting more support, 45% of registered voters, Donald Trump getting 44%. And look, this is something that, you know, it takes some time for the effects of a big event like a debate to truly be reflected in polls. But when you look at those types of numbers, Tara, and with that caveat in mind, I mean, how much of a difference do these debates, and I'll put that in quotes, really make for voters?
Well, so far we've seen that they haven't really made that much of a difference. And that's not just because of what I've said. That's because of what we've seen so far in what others have shown in the past. I mean, you have Professor Altman from American University, who's the guy who predicted 9 out of 10 of the last elections accurately. He said, listen, this is not going to make a difference, and that it's absurd for Democrats to call for a change in their leadership because of the power of incumbency, the power of not having a contested primary. These are all parts of the characteristics of the metrics of what makes for a successful candidacy. So, you know, I think that all of the consternation around what happened on Thursday, I get it. It was jarring and it was not ideal. However, what we saw was President Biden the next day show up and demonstrate who he is and acknowledge that he had a bad debate, acknowledge his age, and promise the American people, look them square to the eye and say, I will never lie to you. He understands what the promise and resilience of the American spirit is, and that's encompassed in Joe Biden. That is not the vision that Donald Trump has. So because we had a debate and Donald Trump got away with lying for 90 minutes, and people were complaining about how CNN handled it. I think there's arguments on both sides, whether it was their job to fact check in real time or whether it was the candidate's job to do it. We could argue that, but I don't think it's the end all or be all. It's June. It is not November. And people need to pay attention and stay focused and keep their eye on the prize of what we need to do here. We need to stand up and fight back against MAGA. Donald Trump is an existential threat to this country, period. Joe Biden is not. And that is where the bottom line is. How dare the New York Times come out so prematurely and make a call like they did 24 hours after what happened at that debate? That's it? That's it? One bad debate, and now we're calling for Joe Biden to step aside? I must have missed the calls for Donald Trump to step aside after he was convicted of 34 felonies and is still facing dozens more. I must have missed the time when they decided to call for Donald Trump to step aside when he incited an insurrection or when he was found guilty of civil penalties for rape. This country and the media really needs to stay focused on what's at stake here and what the difference truly is between the two candidates, because I think they're doing the country a disservice.
You know, Basil, both sides have agreed, though, to go into a second debate on September 10th. I don't know what the merits are of that. I'll be very honest with you. If it is what we saw, which is 90 minutes of Donald Trump lying about Democrats ripping babies out of wombs after they're born and killing them, and lying about immigrants and the dog whistles about people that are coming to this country seeking a better life. It's intolerable. And the promises that are made, Basil, by somebody like Donald Trump saying that he will settle the Ukraine-Russian war as a president-elect before he is sworn into office. I have a problem with the idea that it's just going to be more of the same. Is it worth it then for Joe Biden to even go to that second debate?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And there were so many questions after the last debate as to whether or not even Donald Trump would agree to something because his side felt he did enough in that debate to win. Listen, I think anytime that Joe Biden can go and show that split screen between competence and incompetence, I think is important for the voter. And I agree on this issue of fact checking, right? At Tara's point, can the candidate Joe Biden really fact check in real time his opponent who is bent on lying, but also trying to put out sort of positive, proactive messages about what his administration has done and will do? That's difficult. There's a guy named Kyle Clark in Colorado who in real time was fact-checking Laura Boebert in their debate. And that's in a bit a master class on how to do it in real time if you're a moderator. But if you're the candidate, Joe Biden, I think anytime that you can go and show that distinction, show the American public why you are different and why your administration is going to be vastly different from what Donald Trump could bring, I think that's a good idea.
Let me be clear. Joe Biden fact-checked to the extent that he called Donald Trump a liar on at least 2 occasions, and he invoked malarkey several times. So I think he made it clear. We have to go, but I will say this, and I don't want to Monday morning quarterback Jake and Dana at all, but making Donald Trump answer the question that's posed would be a start. Making the candidate answer the question posed would be a start, in my humble opinion, and making them use that time, because if you're not, that's what the mute button's for. Tara Setmayer and Basil Smikle, thanks so much for being here, my friends. It's good to see you.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.